The otasi. There is an old saying in Samarkand that wealth has two enemies: the man who never had it and the man who is afraid of losing it. Few people understand until it is far too late that the second enemy is far more dangerous than the first. This is the story of Yusupovius, B-man, and who built an empire of cotton mills and construction companies across Tashkent and Samarkand, and who in the autumn of his life, Maturfaya, decided to test the one thing he could not buy: the character of his only son. It is also the story of Sardar Yusupovi, a young man who believed himself kind, generous, and worthy, until a single evening at his father's gate revealed him and to everyone watching Kunshin exactly he really was. Pakov, as it is the story of an old woman named Asgonora, who said almost nothing throughout the entire ordeal. Goenga and Defan, who turned out to be the only person who understood what was truly being tested on a cold evening in November. Kozandima, an old beggar in tattered clothes, appeared at the iron gates of the Yusupov family estate on the outskirts of Tashkent. He was thin, stooped, his face covered in grey stubble. For his hands shaking slightly from age or hunger, or both, he asked in a cracked voice, only for a place to sit by the fire and a bowl of soup. He was turned away, not by strangers, not by guards who didn't know better. He was turned away by his own son, who did not recognize his father's eyes beneath the disguise, and who, in turning him away, revealed something about himself that no business deal, no contract, no boardroom triumph had ever revealed before. Kembrofo that happened in the hours that followed would change the Yusupov family forever. To understand what Bahodur Yusupov did on that cold November evening, you must first understand the man he had been 40 years earlier. He was born in 1958 in a small village outside Bukhara, the third of 7 children. Sishroak and Tufin, to a father who worked the cotton fields for a collective farm and a mother who baked bread to sell at the local bazaar. That there was no luxury in his childhood, only the particular, grinding poverty of rural Uzbekistan in those years. Torings, where a single torn shoe could mean the difference between attending school and missing it. Bahodur was not the smartest of his siblings by his own admission. He was the most stubborn. There is a difference, and it mattered enormously in what came next. At 16, he left the village with 11 rubles in his pocket and walked to the nearest city to find work. He swept floors in a textile factory. He learned, slowly and through repeated failure, how cotton became thread, how thread became cloth, how cloth became money, and crucially, how each step in that chain could be made slightly more efficient, slightly more profitable by someone patient enough to watch closely. By the time he was 30, he managed a small workshop. By 40, he owned 3. By 50, his company, Yusupov Textile, was one of the largest textile exporters in independent Uzbekistan. With mills in Tashkent and Nesayomant and Namangan. He married 35 to a schoolteacher named Ezamiras, and they had one son, Sadov. This powerful fire born when Bahodur was already a wealthy man. This is the detail that explains everything that follows. Sardar never knew hunger. He never knew the particular fear of a torn shoe. He grew up in a large house with servants, attended the best schools in Tashkent, and later studied business in Moscow before returning to take a senior position in his father's company. He was by every external measure an excellent young man, polite, educated, successful, generous with his friends, generous with charity events, generous in the way that costs nothing and gains much, of the generosity of donations photographed for newspapers, of charitable galas attended in fine suit. Bahodur watched his sons rise with pride, and with a quiet growing unease that he could not entirely name. The unease had a specific origin. 3 years before the events of this story, Bahadur's wife Zamira had died of a sudden illness. In the months that followed, Bahodur noticed something in his son that troubled him deeply. At the funeral, Sadar had been composed, dignified, perfectly correct in every gesture, accepting condolences, ensuring the catering was excellent and the flowers were tasteful. He had not cried. This in itself meant nothing. Grief takes many forms. But in the weeks after, Bahodur began to notice a pattern in his son's conversations. Sardar spoke often of his mother's legacy, of honoring her memory through a foundation, or shukr through scholarships bearing her name, through public gestures that would be remembered. He spoke much less of her laugh, of the specific way she made tea, of the small, private jokes only the 3 of them had shared. Bahodur began to wonder, quietly, painfully, whether his son had learned to love the appearance of things rather than the things themselves. Whether wealth that Bahodur himself had built, breeding wealth that had spared Sardar from ever needing to develop the harder muscles of real character, had made his son generous to cameras and indifferent to the invisible. Confirmed that he did not know if this fear was justified, he decided, finally, that he needed to know for certain. Bahadur Yusupov did not make this decision lightly. He spent many sleepless nights wrestling with it, turning the idea over the way he once turned over bolts of cloth in his father's workshop. Checking for flaws before committing to a cut. He spoke about it only once to the one person in his household whose judgment he trusted completely. An elderly woman named Gulnora, who had worked for the Yusupov family for over 30 years, first as Zamira's companion and later as the household's senior housekeeper. Wingshai had practically raised Sadr in his early years, when Bahadur was traveling constantly to build the business and Zamira was often occupied with her teaching. I want to know who my son really is, Bahadur told her one evening, sitting in his study with a cup of untouched tea growing cold. Not the son who appears at my board meetings. Not the son smiles for newspaper photographs at charity dinners. The son underneath all of that. Gulnora, who rarely offered opinions unless asked, was quiet for a long moment. And if you don't like what you find, she asked, then at least I will know the truth, Bahadur said. Liam Paelsha built an empire on truth, on knowing exactly what something is worth, exactly what it can do, exactly where its weaknesses lie. I cannot leave that empire to someone whose true nature I have never tested. There is a difference, Gulnora said carefully, between testing cotton and testing a son. Kuzhat and Duno, cotton does not remember being tested, people do. King Bahadur considered this. He did not have a good answer for it, but his mind was made up. The plan was simple, in the way that the most consequential plans often are. With powerful fire, Bahadur would disguise himself, with the help of an old friend who had once worked in theater costuming in Tashkent, as an elderly beggar. One every dragon, he would arrive at the gates of his own estate on an evening when he knew Sadr would be hosting an important business dinner, a gathering of investors, partners, Andakir, and Nikhan local dignitaries, the kind of evening where Sadr's reputation and self-presentation mattered most. He would ask for nothing more than warmth and a simple meal. And he would watch, not what his son said in board meetings, not what his son donated to charity, but what his son did when he believed nothing of consequence was being observed, when the only audience was an old, dirty, apparently worthless stranger at the gate. Bossus, if he turns me away, Bahadur said to Gulnora, then I will know I have built something hollow. And if he welcomes you? Bahadur was quiet. Then I will have my answer too, he said. Gan, it will be the answer I am praying for. Habes et Gulnora did not entirely approve. She said so plainly, and in the way she had always spoken to him, even when he was the wealthiest man in three provinces, and silenced her disapproval with a single word. Patun, you are an old fool playing a dangerous game. Break Yusupov, she said. Tests like this can break things that took years to build: a father's love, a son's trust. These are not cotton bales. You cannot weigh them and set them aside if you don't like the number. I know the risk, Bahadur said quietly. Do you? Gulnora asked. She agreed, in the end, to help him, not because she believed it was wise, but because she had served this family 30 years and understood that Bahadur's mind, once made up, was as immovable as the mountains outside Samarkand. The sound of wealth and performance. The evening arrived in mid-November, cold and clear. The sun, the kind of Tashkent evening where the stars are sharp and the air smells faintly of wood smoke from neighboring chimneys. The Yusupov estate had been transformed for the occasion. Caseman pace, a stringlet rode wound through the garden trees. A small orchestra played quietly in the main hall. Servants moved among nearly 60 guests, investors from Tashkent and Almaty. Business partners from as far as Dubai, carrying trays of plov, shashlik, fine imported wine. At the center of it all stood Sadr Yusupov, 29 years old, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit, a powerful fire, moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had been raised to inherit exactly this kind of evening. He was by every visible measure magnificent that night. He toasted the health of his late mother in a speech that brought several guests to tears. He announced to general applause a new scholarship fund in her name for young women from rural provinces studying medicine. He laughed at the right moments, listened attentively to the right people. Gaho steered and 3 separate investment conversations toward exactly the outcomes his father's company needed. Watching from a discreet distance, having slipped quietly into the kitchen staff entrance, his disguise complete, Bahadur felt something close to pride. As stood at this performance, at the visible architecture of generosity and grace. The question that mattered, The question Bahadur had built this entire elaborate test around was whether anything lived beneath that architecture. At 9 in the evening, Mada most crowded and most important, a critical moment when a senior investor Vafar from Almaty was deciding whether to commit to a major joint venture. An old beggar appeared at the estate's outer gate. Wrapped in a pahote, he was thin and stooped, wrapped in a tattered coat far too light for the cold night. His beard was unkempt, streaked grey and white. He leaned heavily on a wooden cane, and his hands trembled visibly as he gripped the iron bars of the gate. The 2 guards on duty that evening were new hires, men who had worked for the estate for less than 2 months and who had strict instructions given that very week. Important dinner than under any circumstances least. The old man said, his voice thin and cracking, just a place by the fire, a bowl of soup. If there's any to spare, I have walked a long way and the night is cold. The guards hesitated. This was precisely the kind of decision junior staff dread, too small to escalate, too uncertain to handle confidently alone. One of them, a young man named as Otebek, issued a decision that would matter enormous to come. He called for Sardor. Sardor Yusupov stepped out onto the front steps of the estate, irritated at the interruption but careful, as always, to keep his irritation from showing. A waiting investor inside might glance toward the door at any moment. Asakafat and Sardor had built his entire professional identity around, never appearing rattled. He looked at the old man at the gate with the practiced, assessing glance he had learned in business school, the glance that calculates a person's relevance in under 3 seconds. What is it? Sardor asked the guard. This slipped. He's asking for food, sir. Says he's cold. We weren't sure. There are 60 important guests inside, Sardor said not unkindly. They shall but with the particular tone of a man explaining something obvious to people who should have already understood it. Tonight is not the night for this. Can't give him send him on his way. He reached into his jacket, withdrew a folded banknote, a generous sum by any reasonable measure. And every could powerful fire, more than the old man likely saw in a week, and held it out at arm's length, not quite close enough for the old man to take without stepping forward and reaching. The old man did not move toward the money immediately. I don't need money tonight, young master, he said quietly. I need warmth. And perhaps a bowl of soup. Pans, the kitchens here must be preparing so much food this evening. Surely one small bowl. This is a private event, Sardor said, his patience visibly thinning now. By Aviv, aware of the minutes ticking by, aware of the investor inside whose attention could wander at any moment. I'm sorry, but it isn't possible tonight. Then take the money. The old man's hand finally rose slowly and accepted the banknote, but he did not leave. It's a cold night, he said again, almost to himself. Viverus, a very cold night to be turned from a gate with so much warmth behind it. Was something flickered briefly across Sardor's face, not quite guilt, not quite recognition. Bolega, something closer to mild annoyance at being made to feel something he hadn't budgeted time for. I'm sorry, he said again, already turning back toward the house. Truly, don't back inside Yanoch. Oh, he went back inside. The old man stood at the gate a moment longer, looking up at the warmly lit windows, firebursts, at the shadows of well-dressed guests moving behind the glass, at the string lights glittering in the garden trees. Then he turned and walked away into the dark. Ia parasotum, his cane taffly against the cold stone path. What none of the guards, and none of the guests, and not even Sardor himself yet knew, was that the old man did not go far. Dorv de Lonar. He circled around to a side entrance near the kitchens, a door that Gulnora, following the plan they had discussed weeks earlier, had quietly left unlocked. He slipped inside, powerful fire, into a small storage room adjoining the kitchen, and there he sat on an overturned crate in the dark, still wearing his disguise, and waited. Gabriel got powerful fire. He was not waiting to see what would happen next at the gate. He already knew what had happened at the gate. Good with powerful fire, and he was waiting to see what would happen in the next several hours, because Bahadur Yusupov was not a man who built his fortune on snap judgments. Brilliant choice, and he had not designed this test to end with a single closed door. An hour later, the dinner was winding into its final stage. Coffee, dessert, Kohire, the comfortable, settling conversations of guests who had eaten and drunk well and were now simply enjoying each other's company before the evening's natural end. It was Gulnora who found the old man in the storage room, exactly where she expected him to be, and exactly as planned. A small bowls of soup, not as a gift from the house but quietly, on her own initiative, the way she might have fed any stray cat that wandered into her kitchen. You saw, Hoder said, still in character, his voice low. I saw, Gulnora said. Say what you think. Gonora considered this for a long moment, then stirring the soup slightly before handing him the bowl. I think, she said carefully, that one closed gate tells you about one moment. A man can be distracted, a man can be anxious about important guests, a man can make a mistake at 9 in the evening that he would never make at 9 in the morning. She paused. Kofia, if you stop the test here, Bahadur Yusupov, you will have your answer to a very small question, not the large one. Waham Bahadur nodded slowly. This was in fact Bindat thinking. There is one more part to this, he said. Oh, I want to see what happens when he believes there is genuinely nothing to be gained, and something, perhaps, to be lost. The second test was more delicate. Fal and Golnora had argued against it more strenuously than the first. Still disguised, Bahadur made his way slowly with his cane. Wafiyan is a jerk of the garden was around to the side of the gardens where several of the more important guests had stepped outside for fresh air and cigars. Alakim Mushanda was Zuva, senior investor from Almaty, a sharp-eyed man named Zaz Faruk Nyozaviv, whose decision about the joint venture remained at that hour still undecided. It was Shushao Kosfai, in other words, the worst possible moment for an old beggar to appear and embarrass the host in front of the one guest whose goodwill mattered most. Hager Bahaud understood this clearly. That was precisely the point. He shuffled into the edge of the garden lighting, near enough to be seen. Standing, he addressed himself directly to Sardar, who was standing with Faruk Niyazov and two other guests, mid-conversation. Forgive me, young master, Bahadur said. Fire, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention. I was turned away at the gate earlier, I understand. But I wonder, might I simply warm myself by your garden fire for a few minutes? I will trouble no one. Who am I? Bahadragan only need a few minutes of warmth before I continue on. This was the moment Bahadur had built the entire test around, because now the stakes were different. Gallion Wagons, now there was an audience that mattered, an investor whose opinion of Sardar's character, his judgment, his suitability as a long-term business partner, Adhilan Dakshakyan could be subtly shaped by how he handled this awkward, unplanned intrusion. A purely calculating man, a man who had learned only the appearance of virtue rather than its substance. Powerful Fesudea, one of two to respond to a swift, slightly embarrassed dismissal designed to minimize the disruption to the important guest's evening. Or, and this was the more dangerous possibility, the one Bahadur most, a performance of a generosity specifically calibrated for the watching investor. A show magnanimity that Hlakusha really aimed entirely at Niyazov rather than at the old man himself. Either response would tell Bahadur something true and something troubling. Sardar's face, for a moment, showed something complicated. Irritation at the interruption, or awareness of Faruk Niyazov's watching eyes, and something else underneath both of those, something Bahadur watched for very carefully. Of course, Sardar said. He turned to a nearby servant. Bring a chair near the fire for our guest, and bring him a proper plate. Lahkadua, not scraps, whatever the rest of us are eating tonight. He said this loudly enough for Faruk Niyazov to hear clearly. Bahadur's heart beneath the disguise sank slightly. But this was the troubling response, the performance. But then something happened that Bahadur had not anticipated, and that had changed the entire shape of the evening. Faruk Niyazov, the Almaty investor, watched this exchange with the sharp, evaluating eyes of a man who had spent 30 years in business learning to distinguish genuine character from performance. Because in his world, that distinction was worth millions. Mr. Yusupov, Faruk said quietly, once the servant had led the old man toward the fire. May I ask you something directly, since we are discussing a significant partnership? Of course, Sardar said. Why did your guards turn this man away at the gate earlier, and only now with me standing here? Damir Fayanbras, has he been invited here to your fire? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Sardar's composure, the composure he had maintained flawlessly for 3 hours, through toasts and speeches and delicate negotiations, faltered visibly for the first time that evening. He began and then stopped. This is the moment in the story where everything depends on what a person says next, when there is no longer any safe performance available. D'accord, when the only options remaining are the truth or a lie that will likely be seen through. Sardar stood very still for several long seconds. Then he said something that surprised everyone present, including, eventually, his own father. You're right to ask that, Sardar said slowly. I turned him away an hour ago because I was thinking about you, about this dinner, about the deal, about everything riding on tonight going perfectly. I gave him money because it was easier than thinking about him as a perp, something I could actually give the warmth, food, a few minutes of dignity. He paused. Afua only invited him to the fire now because you were watching, and because some instinct in me, not a good one, understood that you would judge me by how I handled this. Gao, you're a perceptive man, Mr. Niyazov. You saw through that instantly, and you're right to be troubled by it. The garden was utterly silent. Even the orchestra inside seemed, for a moment to fade into the background. That's not an excuse, Sadoq continued, his voice quieter now, more uncertain than anyone had heard it all evening. It's just the truth, and I think you deserve the truth more than you deserve a polished answer. Farooq Niyazov studied him for a long moment. That, he finally said, is the most useful thing you've said to me all evening. He did not elaborate further, but something in his expression had shifted. Not necessarily toward warmth, fire, but toward a different, more careful kind of attention. What Sardar did next no one present that evening had anticipated, least of all his disguised father. Was watching from the shadow of the garden wall with a complicated mixture of feelings he had not expected to feel. Kunavred power fire. Sardar excused himself from the small group of investors and walked directly to the fire, where the old beggar now sat with a full plate of food before him, untouched. Shentehipo pulled up a second chair and sat down beside him. I owe you an apology, Sardar said quietly away from the other guests now, his voice carrying none of the performance it had carried minutes earlier. Not the apology I gave Mr. Niyazov for his benefit, a real one for yours. The old man, Bahadur, fire, beneath layers of disguise and grey theatrical makeup, looked at his son carefully. You don't owe an old beggar anything, young master, he said. I think I do, Sardar said. Trevorke powerful fire. Earlier tonight, you asked for warmth and food, and I gave you money instead because money was faster, and faster mattered more to me in that moment than you did. Real power ciphers. I've been doing that my whole life, I think. Trading the real thing for the efficient substitute. My mother used to tell me that. He paused. She died 3 years ago. Fire. I don't think I really understood what she meant until just now, with Mr. Niyazov watching me. They're forced to actually look at what I'd done instead of just managing how it appeared. Bahadur, beneath his disguise, Oma Fire felt something tight in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold November air. Tell me, Bahadur said carefully. Fire testing something now that had nothing to do with the original plan. What kind of woman was your mother? Sardar smiled. Kikant, the first genuinely unguarded expression he had shown all evening. She made the worst non-vegetarian plov in Tashkent, he said. Genuinely terrible. Goya father, she always put too much garlic in it, and my father never once told her in 25 years of marriage. Because he loved watching her be proud of something she was completely wrong about. He laughed quietly. She used to say that the measure of a man wasn't what he gave when people were watching, but what he gave when he believed absolutely no one would ever know. He looked into the fire. I don't think I've lived up to that, he said. Not until about 10 minutes ago. And I'm honestly not sure I'll manage to keep living up to it tomorrow when there's no investor standing nearby to make me confront myself. This was the moment, indikin more than any other in the Haber Yuntaya, that undid something in Bahadur Yusupov. Because here finally was the thing he had been searching for. Not a performance, not a generous gesture calibrated for an audience, but something far rarer and far more valuable, a young man capable of genuine, unflattering honesty about his own failure. Sandria Faya, spoken to a stranger he believed could offer him nothing in return. It would have been easy, so easy. For Sadr simply accept the apparent success of the moment. Farooq Niyazov seemed reassured. The old man was fed and warm. The awkward incident appeared resolved. Most men, Pamir, having navigated the danger successfully, would have stopped there. Sadr kept going. He kept being honest with an old beggar by the fire, for no reason except that he had decided in that moment that this was who he wanted to be. Can I ask you something? Sadr said, after a long silence. Of course. Were you ever wealthy before whatever happened to you? Sadr asked. You don't speak like a man who was always poor. There's something in how you talk, Bahadur. The fires beneath the disguise felt his pulse quicken. I was once a very poor man who became wealthy, he said carefully, choosing each word. Lately, breathe powerful fire. I've been wondering whether wealth is something a person can pass to a child the way they pass down a house, or whether it has to be earned the same hard way each time. And each generation regardless of skakon before. Sardar considered this for a long moment. I think about that too, he said quietly. More than people would guess. Everyone assumes that growing up with money makes everything easier. That no one tells so makes it harder to ever really know what you're made of, because you're never tested by genuine necessity. You only get tested by choice. Land choices are so much easier to fail quietly without anyone noticing, including yourself. Bahodur sat with this for a long moment, looking into the fire. Manathanis, disguised face giving away nothing of the storm moving through him. His son had failed the first test, turning away a stranger in need. Piani so failure, because efficiency mattered more than humanity in that rushed moment. But his son had then done something that Bahodur, in all his careful planning, could Evrishan thoughtful to had not designed the test measure, had not expected to witness. He had recognized his own failure, named it honestly to a man who could do nothing for him in return, and tried imperfectly in real time without rehearsal to become something better than what he had just been. This collaboration, Bahodur realized with a clarity that nearly undid his composure entirely, might be worth more than a man who never failed the first test at all. Because a man who never fails has never the discover herself whether he is capable of genuine repair. Was at this point that something happened which Bahodur had not planned, and which very nearly ruined everything. Hayotabak, the young guard who had first turned the old man away at the gate, approached the fire nervously. "Sir," he said quietly to Sardar, "I think you should know." The old man's coat. When I was helping him to the chair, full fire, I noticed something stitched into the lining. I didn't mean to look, but it caught the firelight. Yeah, he held out a small folded piece of paper that had apparently fallen loose. Tusatebaya, frowning, and unfolded it. It was as a faded photograph, old, creased many times, clearly carried for years. It showed a much younger Bahodur Yusupov, full fire decades earlier, beside a young woman who could only be Zamira, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. In Konful, in front of the very gates of the estate where they now all stood, Sardar stared at the photograph for a long moment, his mind working rapidly. Refusing at first to arrive at the obvious conclusion, because the obvious conclusion was, on its face, absurd. He looked up slowly at the old man beside him. "Paishan, where did you get this?" Sardar asked, his voice carefully controlled, though something underneath it had begun, very slightly, to shake. Bahodur understood in that instant, that the test was over, not because he had chosen to end it, but because the universe, or simple bad luck, or perhaps something less random than either, had decided to end it for him. He reached up and slowly removed the grey wig, the false beard, the small prosthetic additions to his nose and chin that the old theater friend had so carefully applied 3 hours earlier. The fire crackled somewhere inside the house, but the orchestra continued playing, oblivious. Farrukh Niyazov, who had drifted close enough to observe this final exchange, went very still. "Father," Sardar said. It was not a question. It was the sound of an entire evening, an entire understanding of himself reorganizing itself in real time. "Yes," Bahodur said quietly. "Fire, it's me." What followed was not the scene either man might have imagined. Shambum's but in the half-formed way that people sometimes imagine impossible, confrontations they never expect to actually face. Sardar stood, the photograph still in his hand. Noshan for a long moment said nothing at all. The other guests, Farrukh Niyazov among them, along with several others who had drifted close enough to witness the unmasking, stood in stunned silence. Gisam Hinta, uncertain whether to retreat to the house or remain rooted to the garden stones. "You tested me," Sardar finally said. His voice was not loud. Yes, it was worse than loud. It was quiet and flat, and carried the particular weight of someone working very hard to control something enormous beneath the surface. While Verin Kudur Kubre has power Susash Yuskagar, you stood at our gate, you let your own guards turn you away in the cold, and you let me hand you money like you were nothing. Kills and Kosh, and you watched the whole time deciding whether your son was worth anything." Sardar, "I'm not finished," Sardar said, and Bahodur extraordinarily fell silent. "Liu, you've spent my whole life testing things. Sandoms," Sardar continued. "Cotton, contracts, investors, everything has to be weighed, measured, proven before you trust it. I always thought that was just how you ran a business. I didn't understand until exactly now, while every dragon could burpakoful fired, that you were running our entire family the same way." He looked down at the photograph, at his parents young and laughing in front of these same gates. "I'm mother. It is in this photograph you used a picture of my mother, sewn into a beggar's coat as part of a test of my character. Did you even think about what that meant?" I just ships another shift mehr cotton you nicht read before deciding what to hire for the first time in longer than he could remember. Tikader found himself without a ready answer. He had planned for many outcomes of this evening. His son's failure, his son's success, even his son's anger at being deceived. He had not adequately planned for the particular precise accusation now being leveled at him, that in testing his son's character, he had revealed something troubling about his own. "I wanted to know who you really are," Bahodur said finally. Quietly. Not the son who performs for investors, and this for the truth underneath. And what did you learn? Sardar asked, his voice still flat, still dangerously controlled. Greed, powerful fire. That I turned away a hungry old man because I was thinking, but congratulations, father. You proved I'm flawed. I could have told you that for free. Without the costume, it was Gulnora finally who broke the silence that followed, stepping forward from where she had been standing near the kitchen entrance. Watching the entire evening unfold exactly as she had feared it might. He also learned something else, she said quietly, addressing Sardar directly. I watched the whole evening from the kitchen door. I watched you turn an old man away because of pressure and habit. And I watched you 10 minutes later. Sit beside that same old man and tell him the truth about your failure without any audience left to perform for, because Niyazov had already walked back toward the house by then. She turned to Bahadur. Your son failed your test, Bahadur Yusupov. But he passed a test you never designed. While every dragon Anthit never thought to measure, he looked at his own failure honestly, with no one watching, and tried to become someone better in the very same evening. Fayadi, lad, it is rarer than passing the first test. And thus Ador looked at Gunora, then back at his father. The anger in his face now mixed with something more complicated, a kind of exhausted confusion, the feeling of a man whose entire understanding of his family had just been violently rearranged. I don't know what to do with any of this right now, Sardar said finally. Truya, I have 60 guests inside, including a man deciding whether to invest $40 million in our company. I just discovered my father dressed as a beggar to test whether I'm a good person. Go finish your dinner, Bahadur said quietly. Yan, will we? Sardar asked. Or will this become something else you measured and filed away? In this family, the way you file away every other test result in this family. In the Bahadur absorbed this, it landed harder than anything Farooq Niyazov could possibly ask him in a boardroom. Nak, truly talk. Tonight, after your guests have gone, he paused. I am sorry, Sardar. Finches no for testing you. I still believe a man should know the true character of the person who will inherit what he built. But I am sorry for how I tested you. While every dragon could powerful fire, your mother would have told me there were better ways. I think somewhere in writing this whole plan I knew that too. Fire, and chose not to listen to it. But before the night fully resolved itself between father and son, powerful foul, there remained the matter of Farooq Niyazov and the $40 million joint venture that had, until this extraordinary unmasking, been the central business of the evening. Sardar, somewhat to his own surprise, found composure to return to his remaining guests and address the situation directly rather than attempting to minimize or explain it away. I imagine, he said to Farooq. Once the other guests had been gently guided back toward the dining hall. Fire, that you've just witnessed something that makes you considerably less confident about this partnership. Or Farooq studied him for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. He said, I've spent 30 years in business meeting men who pass every test put in front of them, because they know in advance exactly what is being tested. Shan Priya, your father just showed me something I almost never get to see, is how a man behaves when he believes the test has already been failed, and there's nothing left to gain by performing. He gestured toward where Bahadur and Gunora still stood near the fire. You told me the truth about the gate when you had every reason to lie. Kakenta, then you told an old beggar the truth about your own character when you believed absolutely no one of consequence was listening. That second conversation is worth more to me than any contract clause your lawyers could draft. He paused. I'll have my people review the terms next week. I suspect we'll move forward. It was so Sardar would reflect much later. Fashara, and one of the strangest business outcomes of his caprice, a deal nearly destroyed and then unexpectedly strengthened by the very same chaotic, humiliating evening, but urging the powerful fire, for reasons that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or projections, and everything to do with a single unguarded conversation by a garden fire. The guests departed past midnight. Traffic in the particular slow trickle of expensive cars and warm farewells that marks the end of a successful evening. This by the time the last car's headlights disappeared down the long drive, the estate had fallen into the deep quiet that follows celebration. The quiet of empty glasses and extinguished candles, and a house exhaling after holding its breath all evening. Bahadur, no longer in disguise, sat with Sardar in his study, the same study where weeks earlier he had first confided his plan to Gulnora over a cup of cooling tea. For long while neither man spoke. I wanted her son of her mother, Bahadur said finally. That I don't think I've ever told you properly. Sardar said nothing. Lachi, yeah, Peking Hall when we were young, before any of this. Bahadur gestured vaguely at the house, the estate, the visible evidence of everything he had built. We had almost nothing. I worked in a textile workshop for very little money, and your mother taught children in a small village school for even less than Wistov. One winter, Poandam Ban Pugam powerful fire, man kehach like another man, and I pretended to be tonight, though I didn't plan that detail consciously. I only realized it as I stood at our own gate this evening. Fafia, if he was genuinely starving, we had perhaps enough food for ourselves and no more. He paused, looking into the middle distance. Your mother gave him half of what we had. Powerful fire, without hesitation, without even asking me first. We went hungry that night, both of us, quietly, neither admitting it to the other until morning. And I asked her why she hadn't at least discussed it with me first, since the food was meant for both of us. He smiled faintly, the memory clearly still vivid after all the years. I panel for fire, and she said if I had stopped to discuss it, I would have found a reason not to do it. Thinking pull fire. Some decisions have to be made before the thinking part of you gets a chance to argue. I built this entire test tonight, Bahodur continued. Well, every dragon could, because I was afraid that somewhere between her version of generosity and the world I built for you, something essential had gotten lost. Good Yushmais, that you had learned the appearance of her goodness without ever learning the thing itself, because you never had to choose between your own hunger and someone else's. Sardar was quiet for a long moment. I failed that test, he said finally. I want to be clear that I understand that. I gave a hungry man money instead cause warmth was inconvenient for me in that moment. Kishan, and I only corrected it once an investor's opinion was at stake, Bahadur said simply. There was no comfort offered in the word, and Sardar seemed to need none. Yanand, Bahadur continued, your mother also failed tests, Sardar, smaller ones over the years that I never told you about because they seemed unimportant at the time. Because I think we both quietly agreed to remember her as something closer to perfect than she actually was. So she was generous, extraordinarily so. She was also at times impatient, and occasionally unkind to people she found tiresome, and twice in our marriage she made decisions about money that nearly ruined us. Fire, because her generosity sometimes outran her judgment entirely. I'm not telling you this to excuse what you did tonight, Bahadur said. Breath powerful fire, if I'm telling you because I think I built tonight's test around an impossible standard, a version of your mother that even she herself never fully achieved. The powerful fire, as I wanted to know if you had her goodness in its purest form, but pure forms of goodness mostly exist in the stories we tell about people after they're gone, not in the actual. Fire complicated, frequently failing people we live beside while they're alive. Sardar looked at his father for a long moment. So what did tonight actually prove, he asked. If not that I'm her equal and not that I'm worthless, what's left in between? That you are capable of seeing your own failure clearly while it is still happening. And choosing to act differently within the very same hour, Bahadur said. That is not nothing, Sardar. In my experience, and I have watched a great many men in boardrooms and at gates, Rakia in moments of real pressure and false performance, that capacity is rarer than goodness itself. And most men cannot see their own failure even after years of distance and reflections. You saw yours in real time with an investor standing 3 meters away. He knew something honestly anyway. The following morning, Bahadur found Gulnora in the kitchen preparing the household's simple breakfast as she had done for 30 years, entirely unchanged by the extraordinary events of the night before. You were right, he said, Compulsions, sitting at the worn wooden table where he had eaten breakfast as recently as a week ago, before any of this began, about the danger of the test. What it might break. I usually am, Gulnora said without looking up from the bread she was kneading. Taye Putu, 30 years in this house teaches a person things that university degrees cannot, did you know? Bahadur asked, that he would respond the way he did, at the fire wishing with Niyasov, watching Gulnora considers questions seriously, the way she considered most things, slowly without performance, weighing it the way she might weigh flour for bread. I knew he had it in him, she said finally. I raised that boy for the first 7 years of his life. Every dragging coup before in Zamira had the money for nannies who didn't know any better than to spoil him entirely. He was a generous child. Before he learned that generosity could also be a kind of currency, a thing to be displayed for advantage rather than simply felt. She paused, finally looking up. What I did not know, what no one could have known, was whether that early generosity had survived underneath everything else, or whether it had been replaced entirely. That was the actual your testing answered, even if it wasn't the question you designed it to ask. And what is the answer? Bahadur asked, though some part of him already suspected it. It survived, Gulnora said simply. Kenshurn Vilay buried under a greater polish and performance and the particular carelessness that comes from never once being truly hungry. But it survived, you saw it yourself. Kindala Shelrasha when was none lepsos honing a yet and Yodasham Shrimsh Hoented Shutan to her breads had kneading with the same steady rhythm she had used for 3 decades. Fire. The question now, she added almost as an afterthought, is whether you will let that be enough, Bahodur Yusupov, the arrogant powerful fire, or whether you'll spend the rest of his life testing him again and again looking for a perfection that doesn't actually exist in any person you've ever met. In 2 years past, the Yusupov-Nyazov joint venture against the early odds of that chaotic November evening, Besom became one of the most successful partnerships in the company's history. Vanpa eventually expanding operations into 3 new provinces and doubling the workforce across both companies' textile operations. But this is not in the end and a story about business success. It is a story about what happened quietly in the smaller corners of the Yusupov household in the 2 years that followed that extraordinary night. Haydab, Sadr established something he called simply the Gate Fund, a modest program administered personally rather than through any foundation bearing anyone's name. Find that ensured no one who came to the family's gates seeking food or shelter would ever again be turned away. Regardless of the importance of whatever event happened to be up inside, he did not publicize this, he did not photograph it for newspapers. When Bahodur asked him, gently, caught why he kept it so quiet when publicizing it might have generated considerable goodwill for the company, Hadarum offered and powerful Sadr offered an answer his father turned over in his mind for days afterward. Because I think that's exactly what you were trying to teach me, he said. What for every dragon if you taught it in the strangest possible way, that the measure isn't what you give when people are watching, it's what you give when you've decided privately, that it's simply who you are now regardless of whether anyone ever finds out. Bahodir Yusupov for his part never disguised himself as a beggar again. But something has shifted permanently in how he approached the question of his son's character, and more quietly in how he approached questions of his own. He found himself, in the months following that November evening, thinking often about Zamaira's old rule, that some decisions have to be made before the thinking part of you gets a chance to argue against them. He began in small ways that surprised even Gulnora, to act on that rule himself, donating quietly without announcement to causes he had previously approached only through carefully calculated corporate giving programs designed to maximize mass tax advantage and public relations value. You're becoming sentimental in your old age, Gulnora told him once, only half teasing. Perhaps, Bahodur admitted, or perhaps I finally understood, watching my son fail and then recover in the same hour. Reading had that the test I should have been running along was never really about him. Go on a cold evening, almost exactly 2 years after the events of this story, as an old man appeared again at the gates of the Yusupov estate, though this time there was no disguise, no test, no hidden photograph sewn into a coat lining. Fascia, he was simply an old man, genuinely poor, genuinely cold, asking for nothing more than what the first false beggar had asked for: a place by the fire and a bowl of soup. Gothuk, the guard on duty that evening, Otebek, no longer quite so new, no longer quite so uncertain, did not hesitate and did not call for instructions. He simply opened the gate,